years ago when you talked to Jared Ball. Jared has some very radical and very necessary and important ideas about how this society should be transformed. He also doesn't live them.
Don't be the kettle calling the pot or the pot calling the kettle.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Okay, everybody, welcome back to I Mix What I Like. I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Please do like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, do whatever you can to support the platform, and welcome back.
Been thinking about this, especially now that I think we need to get back to being on the other side of the street and making sure that our communities, the dollar circulates, since we're going to be in this capitalist system.
Absolutely.
Jim Crow provided us with hotels and restaurants and businesses. And
so again, please, everybody, check out, if nothing else, our videos on this, but also, of course, Ebony Reed and Louise Story's 15 cents on the dollar. This again, the circulating dollar mythology has been debunked. So why this platform and this expert scholar won't address themselves to that or engage that conversation, to the least to the extent that I'm aware, and clearly they don't have it right still, I don't know. But please check that work, because this is a fully debunked myth.
I mean, like there was a thriving class. We talked about Robert Church Sr.,
Yes. Yes.
which to me is always kind of the blueprint of what that could look like now, and you think.
But of course, these things, and this is what Marissa Baradaran has talked about. This is what the work that I'm reviewing, that I'm working on, the chapter I just submitted, in fact, covers some of this history in terms of the narrative rise of Black capitalism. And so many people have been challenging this for years. Abram Harris, Manning Marable, Malcolm X, James Lee Boggs. I mean, there's just so many. And for them to pull out these isolated success stories, again, that's what Rockefeller's disciple William Buckley said. Scattered success breeds universal hope. So they keep pulling out these isolated examples of Black business, quote unquote, success stories, and leave out all of the details of the exploitative relationships that they have with even members of their own community, and the fact that they're just rare examples, rare exceptions to the rule. It doesn't help the broader collective. So why they don't engage us, I don't know.
About Harlem and all of the things, and even in that time, you know, the segregation of those folk led to cotton clubs, and maybe not the.
That's
cotton
funny.
clubs,
She
not
said
a good
cotton
example,
club,
but we had places to go and people to see, and folk that even like Louis Armstrong had the means to do things, right?
Yes.
Because I don't know. Do we need an Elon Musk in our community? I say no.
Of
if there's
course
somebody
not.
that's making,
but of course also, by the way. And we've just seen, I don't know if they discussed this, but of course, soundtrack to a coup d'etat, we've seen and discussed in a variety of ways around here how Louis Armstrong was himself. Louis Armstrong was not some independent, powerful, radical, independent actor. He was put to the service of, he was deployed by the State Department in service of their efforts, helping to put cover to what they were doing to destroy Patrice Lumumba. So again, this idea that isolated individual examples of relative Black so-called success is somehow indicative of the path that we should be going on is exactly the opposite of what conclusions should be drawn. We should be, of course, seeing that these are isolated examples. These are as Lorraine Hansberry said, the specifics that obscure the abstracted reality of Black life.
Because I don't know. Do we need an Elon Musk in our community? I say no. If there's somebody that's making that much money, and maybe I guess socialist.
You should say that. No, but that's the thing.
No, you got to back up from that.
I mean, I remember a few years ago when you talked to Jared Ball. Jared has some very radical and very necessary and important ideas about how this society should be transformed. He also doesn't live them. So my thing is, the theory is great.
See, and I don't know what people are doing until they reveal it, right? Because I'm not on.
Well, you could just see them.
Yeah.
This is why the whole academic class, that's why I said the university has to be jailbroken, because the very people writing about radical transformation are tenured college professors with good benefits. So when they start talking about voting for Jill Stein or the third or the fifth or the 15th party in communism, I just started laughing. I'm saying, because some people who are mopping the floor in the building where you doing the Zoom from with that salary need some health care. I'm laughing at y'all. I agree with you in theory. I will go page for page with you on the theory, but then we got to go home. And last time I checked, you got in the Uber. Did you ask that person who was not able to organize for collective bargaining because Kamala Harris's brother-in-law was sitting at Uber and said, "No, we got to break this." You can't get where you're going by just talking about it and writing about it. Now, you will get a nice book contract and you probably get a grant, but it's cognitive dissonance to me.
But that's not the real question, Dr. Carr. The real question should be, as a tenured faculty member yourself and a former department chair at Howard University for over 30 years, where are your writings on radical transformation? I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Okay, so you saw the clip, everybody. I'll put the link to the full episode in the show description. Welcome back to I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Please do like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon if you can. Dip over to the Black Liberation Media Patreon and avail yourself of some of this hot new merch if you're interested, and support that cooperative collective over there. And let's just clarify a couple of things about this wildly intellectually dishonest display that we just saw here from Karen Hunter and Dr. Greg Carr. Just a quick reminder there, for those who may be new to this exchange, Dr. Carr and I do know each other. We go back almost 30 years at this point. I have paneled with him, worked with him, and for many years looked to him to be our generation's new leadership within Africana studies. He is a master teacher. He is an intellectual giant. His power of recall is maybe unsurpassed, but what he's doing here is really inexplicable and unprincipled and dishonest. So let's just start with the personal attack. Why the personal attack? Why the drive-by intellectual swipes at me? I don't know. I would only be able to speculate, but let's just clarify a couple of things. One,
Don't be the kettle calling the pot or the pot calling the kettle.
he knows full well what my situation is at Morgan State University. And in many ways, all of you could too. My salary has been a public record as a state institution. My entire almost 20 years there. So you can look that up. He also knows because when he was chair of the Black Studies Department at Howard University, I reached out to him some years ago because we did have a good working relationship. And I asked him, given what you do know about the struggles I have with Morgan State because of my politics, what could I do to, and this is how I phrased it, write my way into being hired into your department? In other words, can I engage on a set of projects that in so many years down the line would set it up so that you could hire me? He also knows, as I mentioned, that for the better part of 30 years, he himself has been a tenured faculty member and a former department chair at Howard University, the most elite Black university, whereas I am up the road in Baltimore at not that far behind, but a rung or so down, trying to catch up to Howard's status as the first HBCU to reach Research 1 status. I'm at Morgan State, an R2 university, endeavoring to keep up. So he knows that I've had several years of intense hostile struggle with elements of the university itself. He knows that these are based on politics. He knows also very well that at HBCUs we are underpaid, especially those of us not at the elite R1 now, prestigious Howard University, and those of us who have not been tenured as long as he has and who have not been department chair as he has been. So why he's taking shots at my salary in this way is, especially given what his salary must be and must have been all these years, is wild.
Don't be the kettle calling the pot or the pot calling the kettle.
But it's also dishonest in that it has nothing to do with the arguments being made. So to suggest that I am denying health care to workers because of my voting record, when it has been the party that he has voted for that has been in office for a majority of recent history, that is the Democratic Party, has had ample opportunity in certainly Greg Carr's lifetime to enact universal health care or better health care provisions for those workers that he says he's so concerned about. Karen Hunter alludes to, we don't know what people do but Dr. Carr does know, and has known very well for a long time, how I move politically, because he's largely been in support of it for 30 years. For close to 30 years. So for instance, where was all this smoke over the last 30 years when I ran for the Green Party presidential nomination in 2008? He supported that. He supported Cynthia McKinney, at least openly. I don't know if he actually voted that way, and he may in fact have voted for Obama, but there was no smoke for that. There was no hostility for that. When he would come on my radio show, when I would see him at panels, when I would see him at Sankofa Books, there was no smoke for that. When I debated, unfortunately, because it didn't go well for me, but when I debated Michael Eric Dyson at the Real News Network in 2015 with the late, great Glenn Ford, Dr. Carr was in the audience. He was supportive. And when I lamented after the fact to Greg Carr and others, man, I don't think I did a good job, the debate didn't go that well, he was one of those supporting me off the record saying, no, what you did was important in calling out the distinctions between the black radical left and people like Michael Eric Dyson. So where was the smoke for all of this then? Speaking of the late, great Glenn Ford, when and where could anyone tell me where and when Greg Carr ever said one word publicly when they co-paneled in my presence, or privately condemning Glenn Ford's analysis on the Democratic Party not voting for them and why black people should be developing our own political party? Where is the smoke for all? Where is the history of all of that? It doesn't exist. And I would dare Greg Carr to demonstrate that he challenged Glenn Ford when Glenn was alive. And I would love for him to go through Glenn's writings and today do an assessment of where Glenn was wrong in his analysis. It's just much easier to take a drive-by swipe at me. What he's doing here reminds me of the debate we covered recently, the legendary debate that we covered here recently during our 100 Years of Malcolm X celebration between Amiri Baraka and Bill Fletcher. Bill Fletcher, as I showed again, would consistently create straw arguments that he could knock down in his defense of Manning Marable's reinvention of Malcolm X. Greg Carr is doing the same thing here. Instead of laying out the political differences, the ideological differences, and explaining where he sees the flaws in them, he just simply says that people who think like me and act like me are bougie, ineffective, and unserious, or whatever else he was saying there, rather than laying out the fact that what he's really saying is that politically, ideologically, he is not a representative of the black radical tradition. He is at best a black Democrat, maybe a conservative, maybe a slightly left of center liberal Democrat, but certainly not someone who we would have known emanating out of the Africana studies tradition, coming out of the lineage, as he used to like to talk about, of Dr. John Henrik Clarke. Speaking of which, as I've mentioned before, where is your analysis of how Dr. John Henrik Clarke was wrong? You built a career in many ways within ASCAC and Black Studies of riding the coattails of Dr. Clarke. I've championed some of your presentations about Dr. Clarke, as I even said one of them was better than my master's thesis. It was so good. But none of it contained a critique of how Dr. Clarke never supported voting for the Democratic Party and advocated all forms of left of Democratic Party, black radical tradition work and effort. But where's your condemnation of any of that if all of that was so wrong? By the way, when Dr. James Turner, the late great founding director of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, got positions for people like Doc Ben and Dr. Clarke so that they could get well-paid Ivy League faculty positions to compensate them for their life's work. Never with either of them, Ben or Clarke, advocating that we vote for the Democratic Party. Are you then suggesting that Doctors Turner, Ben Jokinen, and Clarke were also these disaffected, bougie, fake radical intellectuals who weren't concerned with the conditions of the working people at Cornell University? Is this it is tempting to start to list all of the things that I've done and maybe to raise things that Dr. Carr has not. But instead of making an assessment or inviting Karen Hunter to an assessment of the work she can't know that I've done that Dr. Carr knows I've done and been involved with, he just leaves it out there that I'm unconcerned with the labor conditions of people because I'm getting book contracts and riding off in Uber cars. But you hang out with the Karen Hunters and the Roland Martins of the world who are making enormous amounts of money. You hang out and want to hang out with the black bourgeoisie in all of their driven cars, and that's what you're doing. And by the way, what book contract have I gotten? You co-signed my first book, I Mix What I Like, a mixtape manifesto, in which you were quoted and referenced favorably. And you were aware that I had no book contract, certainly that came with any money, and all of the royalties I made from that book to this day have ever only gone to political prisoners. But you knew that. So where are the grants that I've gotten? And by the way, as a tenured faculty member at Howard University and former chair of a department, you were supposed to be getting grants. Did you not write grants? You're supposed to get grants for your department. Now, all of a sudden, that is a sign of bougie intellectual activity. And somehow, by the way, I didn't vote for Jill Stein in the last election. I voted for Claudia and Karina of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. But where is the argument that means that I'm somehow not radical and not concerned with the labor conditions? I mean, these things. But again, the real issue is it's intellectually dishonest, because to go back to where they started, if you catch in that clip, Dr. Carr makes reference to my one-time appearance a few years ago on the Karen Hunter show, where I was invited for a very long, friendly discussion about my work, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, which she at the time had not read, okay? We were not there to talk about my views on electoral politics. So you've conflated two issues there to create this straw argument, this straw figure of me that you can attack as you defend your very black capitalist, conservative, neoliberal, anti-revolutionary politics, and then condemn me for wanting to push the envelope. By the way, when the argument traditionally has been you're supposed to try to get tenure so that you can be more of an advocate for others. And I would defy you to demonstrate where I've failed in that track record. But again, only that would require you to be intellectually honest, and that's not what you, Dr. Carr, are clearly interested in these days, unfortunately. The claim that my politics emanate from the black bourgeoisie is itself also, just again to put another finer point or make a finer point on it, is wildly misrepresentative, when in fact your politics are representations and are a defense of the black bourgeoisie. It is the black bourgeoisie only within the black community that benefit from the politics that you advocate there on the Karen Hunter show and on Roland Martin's platform. So you make a defense of your own class position, because again, you are the...
Don't be the kettle calling the pot or the pot calling the kettle.
Tenured Howard University former department chair for 30 years. You are the one who have been welcomed into the highest levels of that university's administrative spaces and been paraded as a representative of that university, where some of us have had to fight. And I'll invite people to check. You could check my video on how I ended up getting full professor and how my work was plagiarized. I'm the one being marginalized and attacked because I've used my position as a full professor with tenure to defend others and to advocate for students and workers. I'm not welcome to the spaces that you are welcomed at Howard University and have been over all these years. But again, where is it that my voting record is somehow anti-black worker or working people, whereas yours only supports the black bourgeoisie? So ultimately, his evidence against me as a person, as a scholar, as an activist or whatever, is that I voted for the Green Party. As I said about Sharpton and them the other day, what this should be seen as you confessing. This is a confession.
They're not confessing.
They're bragging.
By the way, I've never been invited back to Karen Hunter's show. And Carr has never engaged a discussion about my work on buying power, which is ultimately what I think is the real problem here. Again, I have to speculate, but the intellectual dishonesty on display that is in many ways, again, inexplicable, I can only conclude that it is born out of this class and political defense that Carr is making, and that those platforms are there to maintain. But as we wrap here, I think in the conclusion of that work of my book on Black buying power is where I think we do find some of the answers. Now, again, some have raised criticism of my work as not having sufficient solutions. I actually don't agree with that, and I'm increasingly more hostile to that. I think that people just don't agree with the solutions that I do offer in the book, much like is Dr. Carr is exhibiting here, which advocate for moving away from the mythology around what buying power is and moving towards actual redistribution of the wealth that is actually identifiable and exists in the society, and ultimately advocates for that we break with. Although I don't make it overtly, ultimately what I'm advocating for is that we do break with the Democrats and their standard approach to that is limiting, or as Glenn Ford said, the place where radical politics go to die. And of course, Dr. Carr would remember that because he was well aware of Glenn Ford's arguments, and not once did he ever speak up to raise a voice against them, despite what he says is my class position. And is his, by the way, as well.
Don't be the kettle calling the pot or the pot calling the kettle.
Even more so. Again, I just want to reiterate, the politics I represent do not emanate from the Black bourgeoisie. They emanate from the Black radical tradition. They emanate from radical movements in grassroots sectors of these communities. So this idea that advocacy for a United States of Africa under scientific socialism, or Black radical independent parties, the idea that ideas I'm literally taking from Kwame Ture, Malcolm X, James Lee Boggs, the Black Panther Party, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the idea that these are the ideas of the Black bourgeoisie, while he sits there on the Karen Hunter platform and says, no, voting for Kamala Harris is the standard for what grassroots Black radicalism should be, is absurd. But okay, but this is where I think in the conclusion to my book is where I do think we can find a potential answer to what's going on here with Carr and others. This book is titled as it is indeed because once the myth is exposed, there remains the propaganda about the myth, which has its own separate enduring impact and influence. As is often the case, even when exposed to contradicting facts, or in the case of journalism, retracted misinformation, the initial messaging can retain its cognitive dominance. That is the power of propaganda, its continued influence effect. As these scholars write, in 2 experiments, we show that pre-existing attitudes co-determine people's reliance on misinformation. That is, people are more likely to use a piece of information in their reasoning when this piece of information is congruent with their attitudes and beliefs. Unlike some previous research, however, we found that the effectiveness of retractions of misinformation was not affected by attitudes. That is, people's attitudes did not affect the extent to which a retraction reduced their reliance on a piece of attitude-relevant misinformation. To reconcile this finding with the existing literature, we suggested that the effectiveness of attitude-incongruent retractions will depend on whether or not accepting the retraction will induce a requirement to change the underlying attitude. When accepting a retraction does not require change in underlying attitudes, it will not be rejected for attitudinal reasons. When a retraction does challenge a people's underlying attitudes, they will resist it. New fact-based information, if presented but contradicts existing views, can be resisted or is ineffective in penetrating constructed realities. And these are the conclusions reached in studies where there are actual retractions published. In the case of Black buying power, and is the case with the Karen Hunter show, not only have there been no retractions, but the claims are being supported, even produced and published by the commercial presses of both the mainstream and Black community, and have been for decades. In other words, why I'm saying this is relevant here today is because my arguments are, instead of being addressed and dealt with honestly, instead of there being an investigation or even a willingness to read the work in Karen Hunter's case, maybe even Carr's case, there is a defensiveness around what is either known to be the argument or what is thought to be the argument. And what it is a defense of an ideological position. And for Carr, that is clearly being exposed is an ideological position that is one that is very, relative to my own, conservative. And instead of just making an argument based on that, he has to consistently keep doing these things instead of being the scholar he actually is or could be, or the master teacher that he actually is or should be or used to be, which is engage the discussion. You don't even, again, I don't need to be involved. Read the book, do your book review discussions, write a review, publish a review.
Message.
You know, Dr. Carr claims that I get grants and book contracts for taking positions left of the Democratic Party, which is factually incorrect and easily demonstrably incorrect. First of all, everybody knows there's more money on the right wing. There's far more money supporting the Democratic Party and funding those platforms and outlets that will. Dr. Burroughs and I have been talking about for a long time the cottage industry of making sure that something positive was said about Barack Obama in people's books for years, despite the books maybe containing some critiques about race, class, et cetera, economics, whatever. The point being that there is money behind, there is support behind positive portrayals of the dominant wings of the ruling elite, particularly the more right wing. So this idea that you get more money and more book contracts for advocating left of Democratic Party politics is just, again, intellectually dishonest. It's patently absurd. The idea that Dr. Carr could not have himself gotten a grant, as he was supposed to have been doing as chair of a department, or that he couldn't write a book or get a book contract defending the Democratic Party is absurd. There are endless books. We covered 2 new ones coming out just on Malcolm X, supported by the establishment. And we were critical of Manning Marable's book, supported by the biggest book publisher, with an epilogue concluding that Malcolm X would have supported Barack Obama, Condoleezza Rice, and Colin Powell. So Carr, again, is just being wildly intellectually dishonest. It's embarrassing. I have secondhand embarrassment for him. I don't know, maybe I'll come back and say more about this, but I just wanted to put out some sort of response to this and invite people to engage my work and these long and beautiful histories of radical arguments about what we should do with electoral politics. We covered a lot of it with the 100 Years of Malcolm X series. On Saturdays with Renee over there on Black Liberation Media, cover it a lot there as well. There's a lot of great conversations to be had and even some disagreement, but we can do it intellectually honestly if that is the goal. But clearly, it's not. So peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll see you next time right here at I Mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.